Welcome to this video about Liquid Glitcher, an ultra-violence oscillator by the Dutch maker Error Instruments. Liquid Glitcher is entirely different from anything I've reviewed so far. And while it's indeed possible to get noisy, harsh and aggressive tones out of the module, it's able to make somewhat gentle sounds as well. While talking to Paul from Error Instruments, he told me that Liquid Glitcher is all about the little sounds. If you want to get an idea of what to expect from this module, take that in mind. Liquid Glitcher is a one-of-a-kind oscillator depicted as being violent, and at the same time it's all about discovering those little sweet spots. The slightest turn of a knob will get you into all sorts of cross-modulated sweeping signs, reminiscent of old tube radios in a damp Cold War era subterranean shelter. Seriously, sometimes playing with Liquid Glitcher feels more like trying to tune into a frequency to decipher a scrambled message than playing a musical instrument. For those amongst you that are, just like me, accustomed to tuning your VCOs, patching up an arpeggio and finding the root note for a melody, Liquid Glitcher might feel as a fresh start, a new beginning of a sonic adventure. So leave your quantizers at the door and enter the world of something else entirely. Before diving in, I want to thank Error Instruments for sponsoring this video. I haven't got a lot of information on what's happening inside Liquid Glitcher, so I can't really explain the circuits inside the module thoroughly. What I can do is show you how it sounds, what the knobs do, and how the inputs and outputs are implemented. After this brief explanation, there will be a few complete patch breakdowns, so you can get a sense of how I've integrated Liquid Glitcher into my modular system. Let's have a look at the front panel. There's three main outputs for the sound engine. The wave out, which we're listening to right now, the drum out, and the sub out. The one on the left, called wave out, is essentially the main output of Liquid Glitcher, as the three knobs on the top here all influence the sound coming out of it. Turning the knob labeled wave sounds like scanning through a table of waves and or increasing the internal amplitude of the cross-modulation or whatever's happening inside this module. I'm not entirely sure what it actually does, but to be clear, it's not a pitch control. Turning the knob next to it, labeled comp, adds a compressed version of the wave signal to the internal modulation. And you can hear how both of these parameters interact. Turning the knob for sub to the right adds a low sign to this signal that also takes part in the mystery modulation inside Liquid Glitcher. And this knob acts as a coarse tune control for the pitch of the sub oscillator. The signal of the main or wave output is also present at the drum output, but this one needs a trigger, gate, or at least some kind of voltage to produce sound, as it has a built-in low-pass gate. Let's use a trigger from the Lauric repetitor to trigger this low-pass gate. You can also send in an envelope or audio rate signals. It's not possible to patch external signals through the low-pass gate. It can only be used with the internal sound engine. The right output is called the sub-out. There is, as you can hear, some signal bleed from the wave out, but to some extent it's mainly the low sine sub-oscillator that's present at this output. Turning the knob labeled sub to the right increases the pitch of this oscillator, and you can also send in control voltages to the CV input of this sub to get some kind of melody going, but just don't expect it to track 1 volt per octave. Talking about CV inputs, there's also two for the wave and the comp parameter. And although you can send in bipolar signals to these inputs, I found that they really only react to positive control voltages. And the positions of the knobs act as offsets for the CV you send in. Let's add some gates from the Lauric repetitor to the CV inputs. There's one additional knob at the top of Liquid Glitcher, and this one controls the frequency of the built-in oscillator that takes care of the clock. And the flashing triangle in the center of Liquid Glitcher indicates the tempo of this clock. You can send in your own clock signal to the clock input as well, which disables the clock knob entirely. On the bottom of the module, there's 6 clock divided output. There's a divide by 2, a divide by 4, by 32, by 128, by 512, and by 2048. These divided clock outputs can be used to clock or reset other modules, to trigger the low-pass gate, as a square LFO for modulation of every parameter on Liquid Glitcher, or for modulating external modules. And unless you patch any of these inputs back into the module itself, it's not connected to the sound engine at all. Let's listen to the drum output. There's also 2 square LFOs that you can use as modulation for the internal parameters or for any external module. The LFO on the left is a fast LFO, labeled LFO high, with a rate of about 4 to 400 Hz, at which point it still rises in pitch but starts to get more and more offsetted. And the right one is a slow LFO, labeled LFO low, that has a range of about 1 Hz to 70 Hz, at which point the signal also still rises but rapidly disintegrates as it gets offsetted more and more. Let's patch the fast LFO into the CV in for the sub. You can change the rate of the LFO separately by turning these knobs. Let's patch the slow LFO into the CV input for the wave. Just like the clock, these LFOs don't interact with the sound engine of Liquid Glitcher unless you patch them back into one of the inputs. There's also no way to sync or reset these LFOs, so they will always run desynchronized and separate from everything else, unless of course you patch the outputs of the LFO back into the clock input. But in any other situation, the LFOs are completely desynchronized from everything else that's happening. And according to Paul from Error Instruments, that's exactly the point of these LFOs. Even though there's a lot of cables, this is really a simple patch. I have the drive switch engaged, by the way, on the Cosmix mixer, and there's some reverb coming from beats. But let me mute that and let me switch over to the bypass setting, so we're listening to the clean sound of everything. It's not going through the distortion of the Cosmix. Let me mute the kick drum and the snare. This is the sound coming from the drum out on the Liquid Glitcher. This is the sound coming from the sub out. It's going through punch. I'm using it as a VCA and an envelope. And this is the sound coming from the main output or the wave output. And this is going through the punch as well. I'm triggering everything with the Zularic repetitor. So the kick drum is from Crater. And I'm actually using just one LFO to modulate everything. But the LFO is going through the FM8. And there's some envelopes going into the CV input and the mod input on the FM8. Basically, what this does is through zero linear FM, the sine wave I'm sending in from the wave runner to make all these interesting shapes. And I'm just using the different outputs on the FM8 and I've patched those into the CV inputs for the wave, the compressed wave and the sub. And I'm also using the clock on Liquid Glitcher to clock Zularic repetitor. For this patch, I'm using all three outputs, the wave out, the drum out, and the sub out. Long story short, I'm using different envelopes to modulate the CV inputs on Liquid Glitcher, and I'm sending the wave out and the sub out into a separate VCA, both with a separate envelope on it. The sub out is going through the filter. I've melted it through the Bucket Brigade delay, so we have a channel on the left, that's the dry sound, and the channel on the right, which is going through the Bucket Brigade delay. There's no reverb, it's just going through the Cosmix, which is in a dry setting. Let me bypass that. This is without any saturation from the Cosmix. And almost every setting is especially with a patch like this, produces really interesting and usable sounds. And I'm also using the Liquid Glitcher as a master clock. Let me switch to another pattern on the Zularic. And I'm literally just changing the knobs manually and switching between patterns on the Zularic. So this is a really playable patch. For this patch I'm only using the drum output, it's going through the scope, and I'm really just sending in 3 envelopes to the different CV inputs of Liquid Glitcher. Let me remove them. I'm sending in an external clock to the Zularic repetitor, and I'm also using that clock to trigger the low pass gate for the drum out. I'm using an envelope of dual ADSR triggered by one channel of Zularic into the sub CV input. I'm using a second envelope also being triggered by Zularic repetitor into the CV input for the compressed wave. And I'm using a third envelope coming from the punch, also being triggered by the Zularic repetitor. And I'm patching this one into the CV input for the wave. Now this is another really easy patch. Let me remove all the modulation. Actually, the only modulation that's going into Liquid Glitcher at the moment is the square LFO coming from the 128 divided clock, but it's going through an attenuator to attenuate the level of the modulation. And this is causing the pitch change. When I remove this, it's just a static pitch. Let's plug this one back in. We're also listening to two outputs of the Liquid Glitcher. The wave out, which just sound like this. And this is the sub, which is going through the Erica Synths Pico VCF1, which is a Polyvox inspired filter. And I'm using the divide by 2 square LFO from the Liquid Glitcher itself to modulate the filter cutoff. I'm also sending the divide by 4 square LFO output through an attenuator. For this I'm using the Manhattan Analog Mix module, and this one is going back into the CV input for the compressed wave. And I'm using the divide by 32 to trigger an envelope from the punch. And this one is going into the CV input of the wave. And when we listen to both the outputs now, it sounds like this. What I found on Liquid Glitcher is it's always a nice experiment to just switch out the modulations to different inputs. So let's switch these two. Let's increase the clock rate. And let's adjust some settings as well. In the short time I've been using Liquid Glitcher, I found it really useful for adding some interesting percussion to a patch. By modulating the parameters on the module with some kind of modulation, be it internal LFOs, the clock, or some external signal, you get an ever-changing source of clicks, bleeps, and pops. It's also a great noise source for any patch that needs some degradation or audio rate noise modulation. And by tuning it just right, it's also possible to get some clean sounds out of it. Perfectly usable as a drone. Put some reverb on it and you have a noisy wash in the background of your track that creates depth and atmosphere. The design of Liquid Glitcher is interesting to say the least. I think it's a cool mixture of Aztec aesthetics and Freemason iconography. Combined with the binary logo on top, it makes for a really eclectic looking module, and the sound palette of Liquid Glitcher is, in my opinion, nothing short of that description either. If you're looking for a quick way to add some dirt or noise to your system, but you don't like modules that are restricted to either digital noise or static white or pink noise, I think it's worth to take a look at Liquid Glitcher, as it provides plenty of noise and more. I hope you learned something by watching this video and that in some way it helps you to make up your mind if this module is something you like or not. If there's any additional questions, please leave them in the comments. Thanks for watching. Bye.